I am delighted to have been asked to moderate and facilitate this last panel. My name is Patrice Preston Grimes. I'm an associate professor here at UVA in the Curry School of Education, as well as the Associate Dean of African American Affairs. This third panel, entitled Promoting Educational Excellence for Youth of Color, is very significant because after a day and a half of very engaging dialogue, discussions, and talking about these issues, now it's time to think about moving forward. And in that moving forward, I think all of us understand that fundamental to this, that youth are assets, and we've had some excellent examples of people who've presented work as well as their own experiences in that regard. But it's also important that we acknowledge the barriers, and as our previous panelists said, not only is it a bottom-up, but it's a very much top-down process that has to work in tandem. And so hopefully today we will be inspired to act through research as well as practice, and definitely do things that are sustainable. So with that, we've asked three dynamic guests to be with us today. I appreciate their selection for this panel because they represent national and international interests. They've dealt with students locally as well, and I think the dynamic of these three is really going to be engaging. In that regard, our format's going to be a little bit different. Rather than having panelists have presentations with slides and so on, I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to pose a question. I'm going to ask each one of them if they want to respond to that question, and then allow the freedom for them to engage among one another. So hopefully this will be a conversation, and a conversation among our panel that will then, through questions with the audience, extend to you. So here we go. First, I'd like to introduce Bernard Hairston. And again, you can read their bios, but for people who may not have this information, he is with the Albemarle County Public Schools and the 100 Black Men of Central Virginia. And he's the Executive Director of Community Engagement in that particular realm. He was recently appointed Chair of the National Mentoring Committee for the 100 Black Women of America Incorporated. And I have tremendous respect for Bernard because he's a former teacher and middle school and high school principal. Our second panelist is Curtis Chin. Curtis is an award-winning writer and director and community activist. I think that's very important in talking with him. And his credentials are numerous. The movie that was shown on Wednesday night, Tested, he was here doing that, and that has gotten much buzz within the academic as well as public community in terms of its work at looking at high-stakes testing and also racial inequities and disparities for students in school system achievement. And then last but not least, we're very delighted to have David Johns, who is the Executive Director for the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. He has extensive and deep roots on Capitol Hill. He has been an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow and is still very much extremely dedicated and committed to volunteer service within communities. So let's please welcome the three of them, and then we'll begin. So my first question to get our panel started in this realm is, from your perspective, what do you think it means, or what does it look like to promote educational excellence for youth of color? Now switching our conversation to looking at excellence specifically academically and moving forward. What does educational excellence for youth of color look like, or sound like, or mean to you in your realm? Dr. Hairston?
Okay, good morning. I'm one of those folks who, I guess I'm so busy that I don't have a chance to take the time to know what I'm all about. I was looking at the program, and I'm honored to be an agent, a champion of change, so thank you. So I wear a lot of different hats. As an educator in this school division, Albemarle County Public Schools, I've been working with diversity for probably about the last 10 years. I've been an advocate of change, primarily working with African American males in this community, starting programs to offset some of the challenges that they have. So when I look at that question about promoting excellence, to me it's about researching, it's about designing, it's about implementing a model that has shown parity in achievement outcomes. Parity in achievement outcomes before you can think about promoting excellence. You have to show the results before you can think about promoting. Sometimes we do things, kind of backwards. We start, before we can show that this is a workable program, we start promoting it. So as an educator, I'm still in that experimental stage in how you develop this whole thing of excellence on a large scale. I think I've identified excellence on that small scale, but rolling it out on a large scale, it's been a little challenging. So, as an example, the last 8 years, so I've been a part of Albemarle County Public Schools' effort of exploring and practicing a developmental model, or several different models, that are making a difference on that small scale, impacting a select group of K through 12 teachers to develop a broader understanding of what culturally responsive teaching is, how to apply those practices, keyword routinely, in their classrooms first, and to grow that commitment through a school-based professional development model. So when we look at programs in Albemarle County Public Schools, we have adopted Geneva Gay's definition of culturally responsive teaching. We've actually printed posters, made them available for every classroom with that definition, and we like it so much, and it says, it's simple. Culturally responsive teachers use the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and performance styles of diverse students to make learning more appropriate and effective for them. But this is the most critical part. Culturally responsive teachers teach to and through the strengths of their students. So we go on to look at the implementation of excellence seeking programs. When I say that as a practicing educator, I'm seeking excellence. We have looked at grounding culturally responsive teaching practices through researching and personalizing that research to best fit our community and the schools we serve. We have narrowed down the characteristics of culturally responsive teaching practices to 3 characteristics to fit our community. 13% of our students who are African American, 10% who are Hispanic, 5% Asian, 4% other, and 60% white. So with those 3 characteristics, we've drilled down to 1, acknowledging and incorporating the importance of cultural heritage of our students, providing multicultural instruction for relevance and rigor, and building relationships with students and families. So when we look at that very first one of acknowledging and incorporating the importance of cultural heritage, we challenge our students to look at themselves and ask tough questions such as, am I familiar with my student's background? Looking at their race, looking at their ethnicity, looking at their gender orientation, looking at their family and their social values. Asking tough questions such as, do I reflect on my personal biases? And if I do, how are those personal biases aligned with my instructional decisions? And how do my students perceive my personal biases and how I teach them on a day-to-day basis? The whole objective there is for our teachers to become aware of their own culture and the impact it has had on their students. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's neutral, and we want our teachers to then value and respect the diversity of the students sitting in front of them. And the second characteristic of providing multicultural instruction, it's important that relevance is first. If you get the relevance, then you can get the rigor. And we want our teachers to ask tough questions such as, do I take the time to assess the impact of specific instructional approaches on the various cultures in my classroom? Or asking those tough questions like, do I take the time to personalize and differentiate the instruction based on my students' backgrounds, their values, and beliefs? And then, do I really evaluate the impact of what I know about my students? And then that last component of building relationships with students and families, asking the tough questions. Do I strategically and proactively get to know my students and their parents? Am I routinely using what I know in the classroom to reach all of my students? Those are my comments.
And I think the one thing that was so significant that you said is the scaling factor, that it's it's simplistic to think that we can take case studies and automatically replicate them to scale up to get the same kind of results. And so the specific items that you've outlined in terms of heritage, instruction, and relationships, I think are some points that we can anchor. Curtis, in your documentary work, where you've had the opportunity to video and engage with many students in different school systems, what are some common threads that you're seeing in terms of educational excellence being promoted in a positive or affirming way?
Well, first I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to be on this panel, and these esteemed guests for allowing me to share the stage with them. Thanks. No, I just find it really strange because I'm actually one of those students that didn't even want to go to college. I had a different plan, and so it's always strange when I'm in an academic setting. So I just want to tell you guys a little bit about my own background. So
we are special, Curtis.
You are special.
We are special.
I think my parents are very, very happy because it sort of represents the master's or the PhD that I ever got to sort of like hang out with people. So I can say, oh, I presented at Yale, and they can brag to their friends.
Someone needs an honorary degree.
Exactly.
Yes, honorary degrees are great. So basically, my educational background is actually always in the public schools. My parents ran a Chinese restaurant in the inner city of Detroit. My mom didn't graduate from high school. My dad went through one semester in college. But despite all that, their limited own educational background, I think they really understood the value of studying and working hard. And so in between washing dishes at the restaurant or waiting on tables, they always made sure that we had extra math problems and things like that because they felt like that was the way out of our situation, our financial situation. And, luckily I, was focused enough to get enough scholarships and to go off to Michigan. Although my plan was to literally use my savings and buy a Jeep and drive around the U.S. But then my parents found out and then they forced me to apply to school. So anyway, it's also kind of funny that I made this documentary, which you referred to, about these kids in public schools in New York City because A, as I mentioned, I don't really like school, and B, I don't really like kids. But what I do care about is social justice. And
now, we can't let you get away with that in this room, okay? Somebody watch the door when he leaves, all right?
That's a whole nother symposium.
Really? Okay. So we'll make you a convert before you leave here.
Okay.
We'll work on that.
Therapy. There are psychologists in this room. I'm sure I could talk to.
Restorative practices. That's what we need.
Yeah, we need to ask why, right?
Well, there were 6 kids in our family. I'll let that sort of start. But what I do care about is racial justice, equality. I mean, those are things that I learned very early on. And so that's something that my entry point in terms of wanting to make this film. And so what this film did was, it allowed me to follow a dozen families in New York City from different racial, socioeconomic, and religious backgrounds as they pursued this single standardized test to get into these really great high schools. And for me, I really just wanted to see, well, what were some of these things that I had been questioning even as a kid? Because having started off in a school that was predominantly African American, and then, as our family moved up and away from the inner city, ending up in a school that was 99% white, it was really clear to me how opportunities and expectations really changed, as we continued to move away from the city core. And so I wanted to explore that within this documentary. And, there were a lot of things that I learned. I sort of consider it sort of like my PhD, like making this film about education. And I would guess that the most striking thing that I would say when you talk about educational excellence is that because we looked at different communities and, different cultural backgrounds, it was clear that each of these families, they oftentimes have different definitions of what is educational excellence, right?
What is success?
Yeah, what is success? But also, what are they expecting from the schools, right? They come in with a different set of goals, hopes of what they want what to happen to their kid, So I would say, like, for my family, which is an Asian family, when I first started school, it was really all just about academics. It was all just like study, books, numbers and things like that. And, as we got a little bit older and in middle school, the conversation changed a little bit because then it was this notion of, well, you've got to do extracurricular stuff, right? And so there was this whole component of like, well, what kind of extracurricular stuff? And my parents were like, okay, well, you can play a musical instrument, but that's it. Because to them, like violin or
Violin.
piano. Yeah, for Asians, that was considered, something that was important. And then, as we moved into high school, I really had to make a strong case to my parents that, no, there are other things that we need to learn from schools, in particular leadership skills, right? And so I told them I wanted to run for class president, and they were like, no, you need to stay and work in the restaurant because that's your obligation to the family. But I told them that, look, this is part of the high school experience. This is something that I can learn here that I might not be able to learn working at a restaurant, And so, they allowed me to run, and thankfully I won. But in terms of the positive aspect, I guess, the other thing that I would say about educational excellence is just having a further, deeper understanding of how schools fit into the ecosystem of promoting educational excellence, and I think that varies for different communities.
The schools reflect society. I think so often the burden is put on schools to be everything to a community, but schools in many ways, because of the structures now, really reflect as opposed to being able to institute from within, I think.
Yeah, I think that is a changing philosophy, right? Because again, I think back in the day when there were more support services around, in different aspects like health and human service, employment, and things like that, it was easier for schools to just sort of focus on academics. But as the social safety net in America has been sort of snipped away over the last 20, 30 years, there's been more burden placed on schools. But I think also there's some cultural aspect to it in the sense of, looking at different communities, education is not just derived from schools, but sometimes in other places like religious entities or nonprofits or in the family. And I think that's something that we need to talk about in terms of how these different components of promoting educational excellence can work together and how aware they are of contributing to the child's complete knowledge of things.
So the values, as you said, the values that communities have, and my work has been much more historical, and so to see how values of communities can also shift over time. And there's a presumption sometimes that a particular group of people maintains a certain set of values that may or may not be consistent with where people are in the millennium in real time.
Exactly.
Curtis, take it away.
Me, David.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so we're going to tag.
Yeah.
Tap in. So 2 points, 2 questions, and then I want to show a video and then come back to this. So similar to Curtis, I think it's important to anchor so you guys understand that while I now have the pleasure of serving as the executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans, which has an exceptionally long title, but I refuse to let anyone shorten it, in part because an answer to your question of how we move toward or what excellence looks like for our babies is changing the narrative, right? Literally acknowledging there's power and precision and changing the way that we not only talk about our babies and the work, but perceive them as well. And so I am from Inglewood, California, the product of a non-nuclear family, a first-generation college graduate who now has 2 Ivy League degrees and has the experience of sitting in the seat of being a senior advisor to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, reauthorizing legislation that essentially manages all of the child welfare systems in this country, at the same time as I had a sister in Inglewood, California, being a beneficiary of that system, right? Having taught elementary school in Harlem, New York, I taught kindergarten where in 56 kids, in kindergarten there was not a single Black boy, right? At a point in time now which the president has a national campaign to highlight opportunities for us to address the unique challenges that face not only all of our students, but in particular, boys and men of color. And so 2 questions that have been asked that I want to respond to as I continue to, again, answer your first question about what excellence looks like is one, sort of Bernard asked a tough question. And the question I'd like for all of you to ask today is, are we worthy of our children? And not just our babies who show up and do the things that educators want us to do, right? Like do backflips down the library stacks and pick books up and then read them to you in multiple languages. But the kids who are sensitive enough to identify that the spaces they're in don't feel right, and find ways to communicate often in ways that we, as was described previously by the panelists' wonderful job, end up pushing them out of those spaces as a result of. So that's the first question is, are we worthy of our children? Consistent with that, I asked that the next time you do this panel, even if it means you don't invite me, you allow a student to have this seat. The second thing is, what is success, right? I think this question of what are we expecting of our students, sometimes we make things more complicated than they need to be. This might be the kindergarten teacher in me. All schools have an obligation to, if nothing else, ensure that they reach the cognitive, social, and emotional needs of every individual student so that they can fully function in society, so they can thrive, right? And what's interesting about this is we've launched, and I want to just acknowledge one of the brightest students on this campus, Laura Mims, who served as a fellow in our office, and is the reason why I'm here. Lauren has led some amazing work, and within the last month at the White House, we launched a screening and discussion series, again, leveraging that we like media, we black and brown people, we as a country. So how can we use things like films, like The Rule, which is also included in our series, to be able to have some of these conversations? And one of the films in the series is called The Rule, and it's a film about a school in New Jersey, St. Benedict's Academy, which at one point in time served primarily working class and affluent whites, and then as the city changed, based on racial tension and riots, ended up serving African-American boys primarily. They then had to ask, how do we do the work of filling gaps and finding ways to address the fact that there's often discontinuity between that which African-Americans in New Jersey are experiencing in central cities and that which these monks who are coming from other spaces have known to be true. And essentially what they say is the following. Students need opportunities to practice, to cultivate skills, to do things like engage in civil discourse, right? So schools have the obligation to prepare students to be able to thrive. Can you play that video?
Because of the three doctors, we can be our brother's keeper, stay focused, and work to succeed together.
So for anyone who's unfamiliar, this is part of a campaign called Because of Them We Can. I carry their products with me everywhere, but it reflects the story of three brothers from New Jersey who made a pact when they were younger to become doctors. And this campaign is significant because it puts babies in places where they're often not shown, and again talks to us about the power of acknowledging what Asa Hilliard often said, which is that I have never met a child who is not a genius. And there's no secret to how we support them, especially those who are often most neglected and ignored, right? The first thing is to acknowledge that they are human, and the second thing is to support them with love. And the sad reality is that in too many communities across this country, to this question about scale, a child's access to opportunity to literally be able to sit in a space like this is determined by code. Genetic code or zip code. You give me a map and a few characteristics about a child's family, I can almost adequately predict their life outcomes, right? It's the reason why the president established this initiative, which exists alongside some similarly other situated initiatives to leverage resources to be intentional. So three quick things about what's worked. One is acknowledging that learning starts at birth and the preparation for learning starts well before birth. So we spend a lot of time talking about the need to ensure that all of our babies have access to high quality early education, programs, and support services. This is particularly important in the African American community, where African American students and Latino students are most likely to not be in the spaces where they need to be developing the skills upon which the foundation that they develop all future learning and development will then take place. The second thing is finding ways to ensure that our children's experiences pre-K through 12th grade address their cognitive, social, and emotional needs, right? So this is, again, to get away from, although we acknowledge the importance of high-stakes testing environments in which the cognitive skills of our babies are put front and center, but our babies, especially black boys who are often put in spaces where people assume they don't have emotional needs, they don't want love, need that to be at the center of the practice, right? This is also true at a point in time in which we don't spend as much time as we should talking about the mental health needs of our babies, right? Especially those who are existing in a Black Lives Matter era, right? We can say more about that later. The last thing is that it's essential for us to do two things at the same time. One is listen to our babies, and the other is to engage the village in this work, right? So it sounds really simple, but it's not. And I'll go back to where I started. Far too often, adults who find themselves engaged in the work of trying to improve education or support the development of our babies get into rooms like this and talk to one another. We reflect upon what it was like when we were younger and design solutions that we think might meet the needs of our students when we can just ask them themselves. Period. How do you do that? Well, we established a partnership with Johnson Publishing Company, Ebony Magazine, and go around the country and host AFAM Ed Summits, where the only people who get to sit on pretty daises like this, under the White House seal, are students themselves. If you want to ask them one thing, ask them, what do we need to do as caring and concerned adults so you feel safe, engaged, and supported? Period.
Yeah.
Watch what they say and then design solutions that meet what they describe. The second thing is engaging the village in this work. Far too often, not that it happens at this illustrious institution, we play the blame game, right? It's teachers are responsible for all of that. No, social workers are responsible for all of that. No, if the parents only did what they were supposed to do, we wouldn't be having this problem. It's everybody else's problem, right? When the reality is that there are no lay people in this work, right? So while people sometimes say silly things like teaching isn't rocket science, which is accurate, it's a lot harder, and everybody shouldn't be thinking about being an educator. Oh, I have a NASA scientist on record if anybody needs it as a receipt. So while everybody should not be thinking that they can be an educator, everybody should consider it. We should value the role that educators play. Everybody can find some way to show up, right? Whether that's mentoring, whether that's taking a child to homecoming with you to show them the excitement of being on a college campus, whether that's reading with a child and his or her parents to ensure that there's intergenerational practices that are supporting and celebrating excellence. Those two things, while they sound simple, are often the steps that are fundamentally missed, right?
It's doing that ground level work.
That's exactly right. And being thoughtful enough to not only ask the question of why, but then sit through the response.
Exactly.
Right? And often sit in the discomfort of when they tell you that you are the problem.
Exactly.
And aren't showing up in ways that they otherwise need for you to show up in. Right? And so, again, as I close with those two things, listening to the babies and engaging the village, Lauren, again, helped to produce a toolkit that's available on our website, www.ed.gov/AFAM-education. It's a teach-in toolkit, which you can download, and it provides you, hopefully, what we think are all of the resources to support you in providing a platform for young people to do exactly what I've described.
So I think that definitely leads us into the next area, because I'm thinking of Marian Wright Edelman, who founded the Children's Defense Network, specifically because she said kids can't vote. And so who's going to be their advocate? Who's going to be their champion? And what are the things that we can do? So I like your thrust of not focusing on the problems, because we want to focus on the agency. So given that, then, in your respective roles, what are the sorts of things that you think current decision makers and stakeholders can do to make this a reality? You've already given us some examples, David, in terms of listening and engaging the village. Bernard and Curtis, do you have anything in particular you'd like to add to that relative to your programs, or the things that you've seen where that engagement has then come to be, or things that you would like to see people or stakeholders do that you think could move the initiatives and things that you believe in forward?
I'll quickly. Well, I think it was brought up in the earlier panel in terms of talking about the workforce, the people that we're entrusting to educate. The children, the students, it's vitally important that these teachers are aware of these students' lives, right? And so obviously diversifying it, making them more culturally sensitive, I think is something, that could go a long way to making sure well, I'll take a step back and just say, I think like with any type of new policy or new program, it's important that we do talk about structural racism and some of these larger issues, because whether it's the development of these ideas or the implementation, if they've been, I don't want to say compromised, but if they've, somehow been affected by that, then it's really hard to see those things in practice, and have the desired outcome that you want. So I feel like, any type of changes that we want to make needs to have a broader discussion about, again, racism in this country. So,
Bernard?
I'll try to be consistent with my opening comment about as a model for seeking excellence. And so I suppose you start with establishing a system of schools if you're working within a local school division with staff who are trained as culturally proficient educators. And you start there with a vision. You start with leaders from your superintendent to your school board to your principals who buy in. Let me just, do we have any superintendents in the room?
We have a couple.
We have one representing us? All right.
I see Rosa Atkins from City of Charlottesville Schools. Thank you, Rosa.
Do we have any school board members? Good.
Thank you.
How about school-based administrators? Okay. So when we talk about making a difference, let me just share just an example. So recently, I proposed a policy to our school board on equity education. And it started with this sort of language. The Albemarle County School Board believes that equity in opportunities and accessibility to our programs, services, and resources is critical to the achievement of all students. The board values the diversity in our community and staff, seeks to develop a capacity for cultural competency and a commitment to equity and inclusion to enable the fulfillment of our mission and lifelong competencies. Then there was some stuff in between, and then I ended with this kind of an action. This is what must happen. The board shall oversee the implementation and impact of cultural competencies through A, approved staff development for all classified staff on equity and diversity, and for all administrators and teachers to ensure a more culturally relevant educational experience for students and improving student achievement. B, tracking of existing disparities based on past institutional practices to include, but not limited to, enrollment in certain classes, discipline, graduation rates, and gifted education. And third, a superintendent and school board diversity and equity advisory committee to review and provide division strategies for evaluation and accountability of related policies and procedures. Action step to make things happen from the top down.
So I disagree with two things that were said, and again, I acknowledge there is power and precision. One, Bernard suggested that there are a set of schools that need to be established, and Curtis used the phrase culturally sensitive. We have to get out of the habit of talking about cultural competence as if it is distinguishable from being a good teacher or having sound pedagogy. You cannot be a good teacher if you are not culturally competent. And again, I say competent because I don't care about your sensitivities. I need you to be able to meet the individual needs that I have as a student. And this is a responsibility that all of our schools have, period. So as a developmental model seeking excellence, what we have in place are opportunities to create those cultural competencies of our staff. So for example, we have a model where we are certifying all of our teachers as culturally competent educators through a rubric that we have created. That's the first step. The next step, we are certifying schools to become culturally competent schools. So there's a mechanism in place to support the plan. Yeah, I didn't disagree with that. I disagree with the idea and/or the thought that it should be a separate activity that only a certain set engaged in. And to the initial question about scale, we have to link those two in intentional ways.